Hello and welcome to episode 1 of a brand new series called Bicep for Real. In this series, we're going to take a look at using infrastructure as code and Bicep and diving a bit deeper into it, but also using it in a real project. So no more contrived examples, no more deploying a storage account. What we're going to do is we're going to take a project to create a whole bunch of resources that need to work together to support an actual application, and we're going to work through the process of designing, creating, deploying, and managing those resources through the Bicep language. In this course, I'm going to assume that you've got some familiarity with Bicep. You don't need to be an expert, but it's good to have just an understanding of how the language works and maybe have deployed the odd resource with it. If you're not at that point yet, I really suggest you go have a quick look at my ARM template masterclass series, which despite the name does also cover Bicep, and have a work through that, maybe even just the Bicep sections if you push for time, but have a look through that before we start this course because that'll help you get started with the Bicep language. So let's get going. In this first episode, we're just going to have a look at the project we're going to be working on. We're going to get set up with some of the resources we need to work with and get ready for building our project. So welcome to the Lambda Toys digital store project. Lambda Toys are, as the name suggests, a toy company who have been building toys for many, many years, but previously operated without an online store. So this project, they are building out their very first online store for delivering orders, for collecting orders from customers and so on. And you've been tasked with building the infrastructure and the deployment process to get this application out onto the internet and available for people to use. So that's the project we're going to be focusing on, and that's how we're going to work through this example of starting from nothing, from a brand new project, to getting our solution deployed into Azure and ready for use. So this is the application we're going to be looking at. This has been designed already and built by the development team. And it's what we're going to need to deploy. Now, this is an API application, so the web front end for this hasn't been built yet. We're going to ignore that for now. We were deploying the API that manages a store that people send requests to, and it's a fairly simple microservice application based on the Dapper framework, which is a great framework for building microservices if you're not familiar with it. And it consists of a couple of components. You've got the store API at the front end, then you've got the orders service, which sort of takes the orders, and the inventory service, which determines what stock's available. So fairly straightforward service, and we're going to build our infrastructure to support that. And the development team have given us a number of requirements we need to meet. So let's have a look at what's going on here. We need to deploy this application, and it needs to be hosted in Azure. So thankfully, we haven't got any on-prem things to work about. We don't have any multi-cloud or anything to deal with. It's an Azure-only application. Great. It's a container-based application, and as you saw from the previous one, it's kind of microservices, so it's got multiple different containers that need to talk to each other. It's using the Dapper framework, so that needs to be available to it. It's got a data store using a NoSQL type database, and then we've got some requirements here around how we actually build these environments. So we need to make sure that the access to that data store is locked down as securely as possible. So that NoSQL DB needs to have its access restricted really to only the application. Okay, we can do that. The API at the front end that's going to be called from customers needs to be secure. So we need to make sure we put some services in front of that help us lock it down, that help us control access and prevent attacks and all that sort of stuff. Okay. We're going to need to build 3 different environments. So we need a development environment, which is where the development team are going to play about, going to test new versions, are going to try out new things and all that sort of stuff. We've got a test environment where we want to deploy perhaps more stable code into to test it before it gets delivered into production. And then we've got a production environment, which needs to be rock solid. And coupled with that, we need to do some work to make sure that production environment, firstly, is highly available within a single region. That's an Azure region. So we need to make sure that it's got resilience to survive some hardware failures and so on within that one region. But because this is a really important service, we also need to spread it across 2 regions to be able to cope with an entire region failure. So we want an active process across 2 regions. That way we can survive a region failure, but also we should be able to get customers to go to the closest region to them to get a bit of performance benefit as well. So we need to factor that in. The application's been designed to be somewhat stateless and to be able to deal with that, apart from that Cosmos DB, or sorry, the NoSQL DB. I'm making some assumptions here. But we need to build the infrastructure to support that. We obviously need extensive logging and monitoring to make sure we can look after the product once it's deployed. And this is both infrastructure logging, but also capturing the application logs to be able to consume those easily. We need to build a CI/CD set up for deploying the infrastructure. So no manual deployments, at least once we get to past the point of our initial development anyway. We need to make sure we've got a robust automated process for deploying the resources. And this will be one that a lot of you are familiar with. The management have decided, despite all these requirements, we need to strive to keep the costs down as well. So that's an additional factor we need to think about when we're choosing these resources. So we're going to have a look now at how we translate that into Azure resources. So this course isn't just going to focus on how do we write infrastructure code. We've got some architecture pieces here to look at as well. So hopefully you'll find those interesting as well. So let's see about breaking down what we've got in here and what does that actually translate into. So first up, Azure Only. That's pretty straightforward. We know we're going to put it into Azure. So the container-based piece, we're going to put this, obviously it needs to run in containers. So we need a container solution. Okay, we'll see what that is in a little bit. It's using Dapper, so the platform we use in the container solution needs to include Dapper, or at least support it so we can deploy it. Okay, NoSQL database. Well, if we're in Azure and we don't want to run VMs and so on, then really we've only got one choice for NoSQL, and that's going to be Cosmos DB. So we'll add that into our list of things we need to do. Access to the data stores need to be locked down. Okay, so we're talking really here about access to the Cosmos DB. And so we need to lock down access to that. Now we can do that with IP whitelists and so on, but really if we want to make this properly secure and make sure that only thing can access it is the container app, we need to be looking at private endpoints. So we'll add that onto our list. API security, we need to make sure that the API is locked down and has all the security features we can get for it. So really, again, if we're looking for PaaS type services, which I really think we should be, then we're probably going to want to look at API management or APIM. Type that in. Dev test prod. Okay, we're going to need 3 different environments. That's fine. We can work that in. High availability. Okay, so we need to leverage some of the features that are available in Azure to make this solution highly available. So Cosmos out of the box is going to be highly available, so that's great. The container solution is one we're going to have to look at quite closely. How do we deploy our containers into a highly available state? That's going to be an interesting one. And we're going to delve quite deeply into the container piece in a future episode. So we're not going to make any firm decisions yet on what's going into the container piece. Active across 2 regions, so we're going to need some sort of load balancing. So maybe something like Traffic Manager. Excuse my handwriting. Or maybe something else. We'll think about that one a bit. Logging and monitoring. So we're gonna want log analytics. And we're going to want App Insights as well to get the application metrics. Okay, CI/CD. So we're going to look at the platform for doing that. And we've got a couple of options here, actually. We could use GitHub, or we could use Azure DevOps. So we'll have a think about that. And then costs should be kept to a minimum. Okay, so we're going to have to think about the resources we deploy and the skew of those resources. So what's going to be driving the costs here? It's probably going to be the container solution. That's our compute resources. So that's going to be a fairly significant resource. The database could be. There are options we can look at for tuning that. So we'll see how that goes. And probably the API management piece. They can get quite pricey if we don't go down the right route. So those are the things we're going to have a look at. So we'll delve a bit into those and see what that means. So let's try and architect a bit more. Let's think about a diagram of what we're going to deploy. So we're going to use private endpoints, as we said. So if we're going to use private endpoints, we need a virtual network. So let's add that into the mix. Now, if we're going to do that, then we need our container solution. That's going to need to be on the VNet. We've got our Cosmos DB out here, and we've got the private endpoint over here. So this is going to talk like that. We are going to need our API management instance over here, and that's going to bring our traffic in, and that's where traffic is going to come in from the outside world. We're probably going to need to lock this down a bit, so let's add, let's add an NSG in here to make sure that we're only allowing traffic in that we want to. What else do we need? So that's going to run the application. That's the different components we need. We're going to need some logging, so we probably need log analytics and app insights over here. And most of that data is going to come from the container piece. And then we're going to need to add in our HA and load balancing across regions and so on. But we'll come to that later. To start with, we're going to focus on building out what we're going to need in one region, and then we're going to adapt it to move over to the second region, or add in the second region later. We're going to keep things simple. What we'll find over the course of this course, it's really important not to try and do everything at once, because you'll never end up getting anything done. Start small, start with building small units of work that we can, and then we'll build on top of them until we get to the end solution that we're going to use for everything. Okay, so that's what we're not going to try and solution everything right off the bat. Okay, so let's have a quick look at translating that into a slightly better drawn diagram. And we've got our initial setup here. So API management, coming into some container hosting. We're not sure what that is. It might be AKS, the community service. We might look at container apps. We might look at container instances. We might look at web apps. We'll see. We're going to delve into that one a bit deeper when we get to that point. We've got that talking through a private endpoint to Cosmos. We've got our logging. We've got there the basics of what our service is going to look like. Now, we are almost definitely going to add to that over time as we uncover new things, as requirements might change from the development team, or as we just discover that we hadn't thought about something up front. That's the way this works, but we've got something here to start with, and that's where we'll start building out our Bicep files to deploy what we've got here. Okay, now we know what our initial architecture is going to look like. We can go ahead and start building it, but before we can do that, we need to get set up with all the tools we need to be able to work through that. So we've got a list here. First up, you want to install the Azure CLI. Now, I'm not going to install that on the video because it takes a while, but I'll put the links beneath the video so you can go and find the installation requirements and method for your operating system. If you're using Windows, I'd highly recommend using the Chocolatey package management system to install it. It's really easy and straightforward. But once you've got the Azure CLI installed, then you will be able to move on to the next step, which is to install the Bicep command line tools yourself. So if we hop on over to the command line, first things first, we'll just check that I've got the Azure CLI installed. So we can just do AZ, sorry, I do have a habit of slipping into the American version of that. And we'll just do AZ version, and it shows me what version of that I've got installed, which is fine. I've got a couple of updates I should probably do, but we'll do them later. So now what we want to do is install the Bicep command. So we can do the AZ Bicep install, and that will install that for us. And we should now be able to do Bicep -- version, and that should give us the version of Bicep client, which it does. So that's successfully installed. Next up, we want to set up a Git repo to store our resources in. And I'm going to say you should be storing your resources in a Git repo from the start. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to work with that. If you've not used Git before, we're going to have a look at that. We're going to use that throughout the process, so you'll be able to learn how to use Git straight away. Now, you don't have to use GitHub. If you've got Azure DevOps or any other Git repository you want to use, it's absolutely fine. I'm going to use GitHub here so that the source is available for you to use. If you don't have anything, you can create a GitHub account for yourself to follow along, and you can create the repository. You can keep the repository private if you don't want anyone else to look at it, or you can open it up, entirely up to you. But do go and set up a Git repo, because we're going to use it, and it's really important to make sure that you version your code, and so that we have a safe place to store it, and we can see the changes we've made. We can roll back if we need to, and so on. So we're going to go in and we're going to create a repository. So click on the repositories tab here in GitHub, and I want a new repository. I'm going to put it in my account, and we're going to call it Lambda Toys API. Call it infrastructure, just to make sure we don't confuse it with the development piece. Now here you can see you can set it to public or private. I'm going to keep mine public, but if you want to keep yours private, feel free to. I'm going to add a README. It's useful to add a README, just to give you a place to describe what the project's about and give you some information, but also it will initialize the repo and put a file in it for you as well. There's not a preset git ignore for Bicep, so I'm not going to add one. A git ignore file is basically a set of pre-configured resources that are hidden from Git, so that it doesn't try and commit those sort of files. For many languages, there's a lot of common files that need that, so there are some pre-built ones, but we don't have one for Bicep. I am going to use a license here, just because if anyone wants to reuse this code, I want to make sure they can. You don't have to if you're using it personally. It's not a requirement, but I'm going to add that in there. And we're going to go ahead and create repository. Okay, there we go. We can see we've got our repositories been created. It's got those two files that we talked about. The README's just got a header in a minute. We will add some stuff to that later to help anyone who comes along and wants to read it. But that is ready to go. We're going to want to clone this repository. So cloning is effectively downloading the repository to your machine so you can use it. And so we click on this code button, and there's this link here. We just click on the copy link here, and we're going to go and use that. So make a note of that somewhere, and we're going to use that within VS Code as we get set up. And so that's what we'll do now. We'll hop over to VS Code and get that set up as our editor of choice. Okay, so here we are in VS Code, fresh project. We haven't got anything set up yet. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to clone that Git repo. So if you go to the Git, the source control icon over here, and it will tell you that there's nothing select. So we want to clone a repository. And we're going to paste in the URL that we want. And it's going to ask us where we want to put it. And I'm just going to put it in my C drive in a folder called repos. And then it's going to clone it and say, do you want to open it? Yes, we do want to open it. And you can see we've got our initial two files in there. So we just got the README and the license file. And so that's ready on our machine to work with. The next thing we're going to need, if we're going to work with Bicep, we want the Bicep extension installed for VS Code. It gives us a lot of useful IntelliSense and snippets and all sorts of stuff. So if we go into the extensions button here, and if we search for Bicep, and you should see the Bicep extension here, you can have a look, just check it's the one from Microsoft. You can view the details if you want to. We're going to go ahead and click install. It takes a little minute. There we go. It's installed now, and we can test that's working. We'll go in here. We'll create a new file. We'll just call it test.bicep, and this is going to load. And you should see this in the bottom right here, pop up saying launching the Bicep service. If you hadn't missed that, it will start the service, and then we should be able to get some snippets in here. So if we start typing resource, we can see we've got the resources here. We can say own resource with defaults, and that will fill that in for us, and that's going to be really useful to help us get started with the project. We can get rid of that test file for now. We don't really care about it, and we're all set. We're ready to go with starting our first resource. Okay, and that's where we're going to finish today. We're ready to go. In the next episode, we are going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to start creating the Bicep files to build some of the core infrastructure that we know what we're going to build. So things like the virtual network, the Cosmos DB, the private endpoint, all that sort of stuff that we know what it's going to be. We're going to build that out initially, and that will be our sort of first go at building some Bicep, but with real examples. We're not just going to stick out a storage account. We're going to create real stuff that's going to be used by our application. And as the weeks go on, we're going to add and layer on more into that. We'll add the container storage solution, and we'll think about what we're going to use for container runtimes. We're going to add the API management. We're going to add in all the bits and pieces we talked about before, and we're going to build out that environment until we've got a real example that meets all those requirements we saw in that first slide. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that was useful and informative, and hopefully it gets you excited about the rest of the series. We're going to get quite deep on the Bicep stuff. We're going to get quite complicated, but we're also going to look at some other topics like, we talked about Git there. We're going to look at some architecture stuff. We're going to look at lots of different bits and pieces. So hopefully you'll look forward to the rest of the videos coming out for the series.